Welcome back to the Epic Universal Podcast. I'm entertainment writer Jim Hill, and this is the podcast where we cover the latest Universal news, rumors, and history. And as always, I'm joined by Eric Hersey, who has some exciting news for the coming months in regard to this podcast.
Right, Jim. We have done it. I will get to see Universal Studios Hollywood with my own eyes. My feet will touch the upper and the lower lot along with my family. We've finally pulled the trigger and made it happen. We are heading out west in the early March. So we'll get to, and we're going to stay, I believe we're going to book the Lowe's hotel, which is like, I guess, great location. But I was on their website and we did all the planning. So when you talk about things, which you'll be talking about Hollywood today in the feature, I believe. I'll know what the heck you're talking about. I'll be able to visualize. And life is so much easier that way.
Yeah. Now, by the way, folks, we are trying to finagle for me to be out there at this same time, so we can maybe record some shows on site and maybe do some interesting side trips. But we'll talk further about that as we get closer to the actual, heading out to California. But toward that end, a lot of show today. In fact, thanks to a number of listeners who have shared info or, their experiences, which Eric and I will be talking about later in today's show. And we'll be continuing our series of looking back at the early days of the Tram tour and some of the weirder show scenes.
Burning houses and cabins and such, right?
Well, this time around, it's runaway trains.
Oh, beautiful.
Okay, but before we get to that, we of course have to acknowledge our sponsor.
Yeah, Jim, and this is actually perfect timing, truthfully, to talk about our friends at Unlocked Magic, because as we just discussed, I'm heading to Hollywood, and we are going to Universal Studios, but there is another little park in that area that we call Disneyland, and they're celebrating their 70th, and Lauren was very jazzed, and the kids are excited to go there. And we've been before, and the last time I think we booked organically through their website, and I'm like, well, let's check out a couple different options here, and we're pricing things out, and we're seeing about staying on property, or we're buying the tickets direct, or we're just seeing what promotions they're running. So I went over to unlockedmagic.com, and sure enough, you can buy Disneyland tickets there. And even better, we were able to save several $100s just on the tickets, and it actually beat out the in-house pricing discounts that if you were going directly through Disneyland and staying on property and so forth. So it was easy to go through. You can actually do your park hoppers there. You could even do your lightning lanes, all from unlockedmagic.com. And that doesn't just count Disneyland. You can do Disney World. You can do Universal Florida. So I'm not just saying this because they're the sponsor of our today's show. I'm actually saying this because I'm a very happy customer after doing this. And I've already got my savings spent because we're going to be eating at the Carthay Circle restaurant with all that money that I'm saving from Unlocked Magic. So,
okay. And knowing how expensive it is to eat at Carthay Circle. Wow. You saved a lot of money. Yeah, wow.
Yes.
Okay. Well, cool. All right. So getting to the news portion of today's show. And I apologize, folks. When I was initially looking over the reference doc that Eric put together, I was like, something about IT at Universal. No, moron, it, as in the Stephen King it. Also, HBO, big series right now, Welcome to Derry. But let's talk further about this.
Well, we talked about it last week. There was rumors, and there still is rumors of getting a It house for Halloween Horror Nights. And we speculated that, this is a Warner Brother, or it's not a Universal property, and they haven't been used. But we did have some friends of the show, Ashley and even Stingray Travel, both sent some It-related pictures and information, and you even chimed in on this, but it turns out it was at the WB Studios Tour Halloween event. So not at Universal, but really it is not foreign to these houses. And what do you recall from this?
Well, no, this event, which was called Horror Made Here, a Festival of Frights. Again, it was held on the Warner Brothers studio lot, which is actually, is that the lookalike? All right. Anyway, and it was one of these things where people who went to it, it was like, oh my God, this is wonderful. They've done such a great job, and this will be such a fun add to. I mean, face it, Southern California, when it comes to Halloween, already has ridiculously strong attractions, whether it's Not Scary Farm or, of course, the Universal Halloween Horror Nights, the version that's held on Halloween, even the Oogie Boogie Nights over at California Adventure. But the thing that kind of broke my heart is, I want to say it got presented. Was it just 1 year or 2 years? I mean, I want to say it started in 2017, and I think there was one more edition the following year, 2018, and then it just never came back. And the story I always heard was that the management at the Burbank lot in Universal, the Burbank lot for Warner's, it's just sort of like, we're putting a lot of effort and a lot of time and a lot of money into this, and we're not getting all that big a return. So it's like, okay, we're not going to do this anymore. And but yeah, it kind of broke my heart, because it was one of those things where, next year I got to get out there and do that. That looks amazing, and there was no next year.
Yeah,
so.
That's kind of the thing. And I guess from what I understand, and I looked this up, that primarily now, if you're looking for it characters or representation, there's some at the Six Flags parks, but it's not like a house or anything. It's just more like walk around characters. And truth be told, I was having a really hard time finding anything on the internet besides like fans pictures and citations. So there is, but it was, I guess, Six Flags Magic Mountain, and then Six Flags Great America or Great Adventure, has some type of it representation. The clown, Pennywise walking around and so forth. But very interesting. It doesn't seem like it's hammered down. And if they're not doing it at Warner Brothers and just a little bit at Six Flags, maybe we do have that speculation. Maybe it could turn into something. And I think it would be a hit, because what they did at Warner Brothers looked really cool.
Oh, no, absolutely. Just that's the thing. You saw the pictures of what they were doing, and it's like, ooh. And let's also remember, again, given, what's just happened with it, Welcome to Derry, and what a huge hit that has been for HBO. And I want to say that, they are talking about a season 2 and a season 3. So it's not like this IP is going away anytime soon. So again, just be interesting to see whether it's a Universal or a Six Flags do something of size with Pennywise. But on the other hand, I will be observing this from a great distance, because that clown scares the hell out of me.
Yeah, you just send Hunter and I in.
There we go. There we go. All right, there you go. Okay.
Well, we also have. We were talking earlier. This is one of the things. If we go out to California, you're like, hey, what do you think about a 4-hour drive to our favorite Universal Horror Unleashed? And I said, well, the girls won't do it, but I think Hunter and I would. But we did get some nice listener emails. We were looking just to get more information, especially if we're trying to go out there. And as you, the listener, starts maybe traveling, if Vegas is in your plan. So we do have some information here from Brian, Mark, and Suzanne. We're so kind to email us some stuff. So a couple takeaways about Horror Unleashed. Were you able to check any of these emails out, Jim?
I was. And again, I so appreciate what Brian, Mark, and Suzanne did here. I mean, this is actual good, solid, practical information about what the experience at Halloween Horror Unleashed today is like.
Right. And this is kind of what we're saying. Get there now, because right now, look, almost collectively, they're all saying low crowds and a very flexible entry. So very light attendance. They were allowed, you have to get a reservation, but they were almost letting you in early just based off of it. And one of the interesting things was Brian actually talked to the staff, and they said about 30 to 40% of the guests are walk-ups. And the first 2 hours are the busiest part of the day. So like if you want to go, if you go after 4 p.m., it makes the repeat walkthroughs easy and a lot better. So it's like show up early. One of the other things, and I think we've talked about this throughout since the announcement is that there's never been anybody talking about the quality. The quality of the houses and the performers were all praised by everybody that we've kind of talked to so far. And they're some of the scare actors are handling multiple roles, and they're doing really good from spacing out the group so you have your time to be part of that. So I think like right now, if I was someone traveling, I'm like, hey, that sounds amazing. Low crowds and high quality. But there's still quirks and there's some type of issues, right? I think one of maybe Brian or Mark or Suzanne all maybe said that online there was some rules that were not necessarily enforced. Things were like where it says you can't use your photos, but yet or photography or video cameras, but yet you could. And there was reliance on QR codes that are frustrating and poor cell phone service. So there are aspects there. And from a vibe standpoint, like the shows and the food and the merch are all kind of like secondary options. Not so busy in terms of like, the staff might have been standing around. So it doesn't necessarily always feel like it's a happening spot, which whether, debating on your preference, if you like to be with a whole bunch of people or not. Right now, it does seem kind of empty a little bit. So,
you could say that, but about all of Vegas right now. But
right.
Though the interesting note isn't this week when the Consumer Electronics Show is in Vegas as well.
That'll be a tell if we get more people out there, right? Like if it starts busy, if it's getting busy, that'd be very interesting to tell. We know last time we reported it was like rodeo week, which was supposed to be busy, but yet wasn't. So we'll see. But I just think it's something that we keep an eye on still. And if I'm out there and we can figure out how to make it work, I would love to kind of see this in person and make this my introductory experience, because I'm looking forward. I like the Monsters house. I think that would be one that I certainly would want to go through.
Okay. So and anything to sum up here or?
Well, I mean, ultimately, get out there now. Number one, right? It might not be something that is a repeatable. So I don't know if the guests and the locals are going to continuously go. I guess it doesn't have a huge repeatability. So so what they did with Krampus and during the Christmas time, I think they're going to have to continue to pull off to get some of these locals. But please, everyone else go out there so that way Jim and I can find time to get out there. Make sure this thing still lasts. But it sounds like low crowds and high quality. It sounds like it's a good experience for those who like it,
Well, there we go. All right. Well, again, just want to once again thank Brian, Mark, and Suzanne for sharing this great info. Pivoting to kind of a sad note. We have to talk about Adam the Woo.
Yeah. So listener Chris actually reached out this morning via X and was like, hey, did you guys ever, talk about Adam the Woo or stuff? And truth be told, it was maybe a day after the announcing. Jim and I, after our show ended, we went offline. I said, hey, Jim, did you hear about Adam the Woo? And it was breaking news at the time. So for those who are not aware of Adam the Woo, he is probably one of the more prolific vloggers of the YouTube age.
He was.
And he was he was early known for doing some urban exploring.
He was.
And might have got his hand smacked a little bit, but
he did. In fact, if I could tell a story here, Adam got trespassed for Walt Disney World. And this is actually when Adam reached out to me, because once upon a time, and you can Google this, folks, I got trespassed from Disneyland. And he, by that point, I was working with the Huffington Post and always forgiven at Disney. And, but he reached out and he was kind of heartbroken because, of course, he loves these places. He loved the Disney parks. And he's like, how am I going to get back in? And it's like, I just basically told him, Adam, just do good work. Just keep motoring on. Just do good work, and this will all go in the rear view. And Adam, to his credit, took that advice, motored on, and sure enough, the trespass, the issues with Disney, they went away, and he was able to get back in there. In fact, that's I think the irony of this whole thing is that when we lost him, I mean, Adam was living in celebration.
Yeah.
The Disney built, a little small town, next to the resort. But yeah, I mean,
And the thing with that thing, the funny thing about Adam is that
Mm.
he's living in Celebration, and there's the fan community has really, it's kind of broken up.
Mhm.
I never met Adam. Actually
Mhm.
saw him 3 times in the theme parks. He was
Oh.
very close to us at D23, but
Mhm.
I'm always one of those like, this is kind of their job. I'm not going to go up and bother anybody. I just
Oh,
never
yeah.
never do
Yeah.
that. But
Mhm.
we were at Captain Cook's in the same room one time, and the kids were all like, "That's Adam the Woo," and I'm like, it's so
Mhm.
funny that he was like the original vlogger and the influencer, and such a kind. All these great stories about him being kind, but he kind of came into notice because of like the River Country video and one we
Yep.
talked about, which is the
Mhm.
Nickelodeon Studios. He kind of made his way
Yes.
in. We got some great
Yes.
footage there,
Mhm.
and that was kind of where Chris was asking, "Hey, did you guys ever talk about that?" And we did. So for those who kind of want to hear a little bit about the Nickelodeon Studios, that's actually episode 55. That was an episode we recorded in
Mhm.
June 13th of last year, and we did talk a little bit about Adam. But I thought it
Mhm.
was a good opportunity to talk about the what he did for the community. He was one of the huge influencers for me because the River Country story was probably the kicker that got me invested in Disney history. I was so fascinated by
Mhm.
that, and same with Nickelodeon Studios. I was fascinated by seeing this part of the park that was just left unkept. And we'll miss all his videos. And he used to do a daily vlog.
He did. He did. I mean, he would, again, that just a brief note here to, Eric and I want to offer our sincerest condolences to Adam's friends and family. It's obviously got to be a sad time because, again, he was out and about the day before.
Right.
This is just kind of a shock. Relatively young guy, but no, did a lot of good work, helped a lot of people over time, and he will be missed.
Absolutely, absolutely. But we'll move on to something I think Adam the Woo would actually enjoy this next survey that we got through because he was a big Universal fan, Steven Spielberg, all that, so
Mhm.
forth. But Jim, I don't know if you saw this one, but an anonymous, user sent over a nice little survey that we got. So it's outlining a proposed immersive backlot and tram style attraction themed to the films of Steven Spielberg and Amblin Entertainment. So obviously this is concept only. It's just presented for
Mhm.
feedback. But did you get a chance to look at this survey? It's just one question I got. And there's one question I needed.
Yeah, I mean, it's intriguing in that it seems to be okay. The tram stops, you get off and experience this. Which again, from an operational point of view, and what's interesting is it's just one filmmaker, just a
Yeah.
thing that's celebrating just one filmmaker. So what are your thoughts about what they shared here?
Well, it's just yeah, like you said, and they mentioned like ET and Jurassic Park explicitly, but they're asking what
Hmm.
what your interest level is the ultimate thing. But it reminded me a lot of the Back to the Future at the Fan Fest kind of deal, where like they take you down in the lot and they drop you off there, and it's a whole area that is based off Back
There
to
we
the
go.
Future. I'm not sure if they could do something like that, so I don't know if this is part of the normal tram or this is like, hey, next year's Fan Fest. But there's certainly all the properties that can make this really work, right?
No, absolutely. And let's remember that, we have the Disclosure film coming out this summer, which, everyone is sort of hyping as, the follow-up to Close Encounters in ET. And if that's, and that's, by the way, being produced by Universal
Yeah.
and released by Universal. And if that's a big enough hit, that's gas in the tank. It'll just be interesting to see, how they would go about this. Because again, it's one thing to do this for a fan fest. It's quite another to, all right, we're creating a standalone attraction. The tram pulls up here, you get out, and then you rebook. Do what? Do you reboard the tram and continue the tour? I mean, it's they've done that in the past. Universal used to have a special effects show on the lower lot where that you literally your tram parked, you got off, you went in and experienced it, and you came out and continued the tram tour. And they ultimately discontinued that because it made running the tram less efficient.
Right.
So it just kind kind of interesting to watch the company circling back on this idea.
Yeah, and well, the fun part for the speculation I had and from the anonymous survey was like, could we see a walk around Steven Spielberg character? And I said that's kind of fascinating to think about, you know. So.
Okay, interesting idea. Don't see it happening, but all right.
Yeah.
So we pivot now from something that may happen in Hollywood to something that is happening in Florida.
Right. Well, this is just a kind of a passing by because I don't know much more about it, but there are construction walls already up at Epic Universe. The Celestial Park now has some walls up, and as we know, they are currently working on expanding this park, and we saw land over by Harry Potter, and there's land here by the Super Nintendo, and then there's land by the Dark Universe. So, but we have walls up, which means things are happening. Jim, any idea what they might be working on, or right now the aerial photos just kind of show dirt moving, right?
Well, again, this is a park that does need capacity. So, that is priority one right now, making sure that, and more to the point, having something that guests can do right off of Celestial Park. A very smart move. I'm going to say this much, though, given how much I love Celestial Park, which, to credit Mark Woodbury, I think he was the one who said that, our goal with this area in Epic Universe is to put the park back in a theme park. Lovely, green, lush, amazing horticulture. As long as they expand the park and don't screw up, the center there, I'm good. I'm good. It's just, add new stuff. Just don't screw up what you got there now, because it really is handsome. Though I guess if circling back to something we were talking about on an earlier installment of the Epic Universal podcast, given that I guess we're getting that much closer to an actual nighttime show around the central fountain there. Maybe with people now moving into that part of the park, it's like it's okay to expand in another corner. So,
okay. I was going to say, you're not telling me they're putting bleachers up, are you? Because that's not fun.
No, not at all. But I guess, again, I got to stop being a whiny baby man. Change is good, all right?
No, listen, we need some capacity there, and we'll see what's coming. So we'll keep alert there and see what that is in the coming weeks.
Okay. Well, all right, folks. So that's the news portion of this week's show. And when we return from this break, we'll continue our look back at some of the earlier, show scenes that you saw on the Tram tour out in Hollywood. But before we do that, there's this. And we're back, folks. Okay. Eric and I are picking up where we left off with last week's Epic Universal podcast, where again, we were looking at the early days of the Tram tour, where at Lou Wasserman's request, Jay Stein was trying different things, adding brief show scenes along the Tram tour, especially with an eye toward those days when there wasn't a whole lot going on the lower, like say Sunday, when people were home and not making TV shows or movies. And we've talked at length on previous, Epic Universal podcasts about the flash flood scene that was added to the El Mexico part of the backlot, and how Lou turned to Jay and said, that I want more of those. And again, not everything that Jay tried was successful. And we talked at length on last week's show about the Tarzan parody scene that got added to the Tram route, with the gorilla swinging by, clutching the severed human arm, and how moms wrote in and said, "You traumatized my child." And Lou was like, "Make that go away." Though I did have somebody reach out, Eric, who said, and it was kind of interesting because this opened summer of '69, and but only for the summer of '69. If you came, did you see the gorilla clutching the severed arm? On the other hand, if you came back for the summer of 1970, it was a gorilla, swinging through with no severed human arm. That evidently somebody had gotten a ladder, climbed up, pulled it out of its arm. But now the gag didn't work,
Right.
but at the same time they had spent the money, and so it said, they just ran it till like 74, and then it kind of, one day it didn't work anymore, and it's like, good, shoot this thing, put it out of our misery. But anyway, all right, so we're back to A.J. Stein walking the length of the Tram tour, looking for opportunities to add new show scenes. And at this point, Jay arrives at 6 Points, Texas. And Eric, have we ever talked about this part of the Universal backlot before, 6 Points, Texas?
No, Jim, I literally thought it was a theme park in Texas when you just said that. So you'll have to explain.
Six Flags, right?
Yes,
Six Flags over Texas, by the way. Well, no, this actually dates back to the early days of Universal City. And remember, Carl Laemmle, he founds the Universal Film Manufacturing Company back in 1912, and remember that that's the silent era of Hollywood.
Right.
Sound films won't come around for another 16 years with the debut of The Jazz Singer, October of 1928. So,
which I know from the Carousel of Progress. That's how I get all my news. No,
great, man, beautiful. All right. Yeah. Anyway, westerns are a hugely popular movie genre back then. So much so that Carl has built. Again, this is what's now the lower lot of Universal. He has this weird conglomeration of Western-themed streets built that eventually become known as 6 Points, Texas. And that they gets that name because there's one central area inside of 6 Points where all of these Western sets sort of catty corner off of. You got Laramie Street next to Denver Street next to the OK. I mean, you get the idea. But because of the way they all came together, all of these streets, and by the way, every single one of these streets was a complete Western town. They had the bank, the saloon, the sheriff's office, the livery stable, so the idea was that, especially during the silent era, you could be shooting 6 different Westerns at the exact same time. And in fact, because it's the silent era, you don't have to worry about the noise that's happening one street over. Right. Just like, keep shooting. Don't look. Yes, I know. There's a stampede. Keep shooting. But anyway, all right. This is now the early 1970s. And the Western, as both a movie and a TV genre, are kind of fading at this point. In fact, The Virginian, the long-running TV series that was shot down in 6 Points, Texas, it started shooting there in 1962. It's about to end its 9-year run on NBC in March of 71, which means for the first time in decades, there's not going to be any shootouts going on. There's no bank robberies. There's no cattle rustling. And 6 Points, Texas has become something of a ghost town, an underutilized corner of the backlot.
Just tumbleweeds. That's all it is. Just tumbleweeds.
There we go. And yet, the interesting thing is that, these are not tumbleweeds that have been put in place by the set decorator. It's right. Like, these are legitimate tumbleweeds. All right. So, all right. Anyway, so Jay's walking through this part of Universal City Studios, which, by the way, they liked to take the Tram tour through because, so many films that people had actually seen, like W.C. Fields' My Little Chickadee and John Wayne's The War Wagon, not to mention popular TV shows, Laramie, Alias Smith and Jones, they had all actually been shot down there. So, Stein is now standing in this never used to be quiet corner of the Universal lot. And he says, you know what? This area needs a J bang, something big that suddenly comes out of nowhere and scares the hell out of everybody. So, so what is Jay envisioning? A full-size runaway train, something.
Oh, okay.
Something with the steam whistle blaring and the bell clanging that seemed to be bearing down on the tram, headed for, it almost certain, collision. And so, in a moment, we'll get to how the effects wizards at Universal actually pulled the show scene off, making it something that could be reset in 2 minutes. But, on the other hand, we'll also talk why it took 5 years to get this thing that would reset in 2 minutes built. But first, there's this.
I had that dream again. My small business needs to hire, but I don't use LinkedIn and I hire wrong. So our orders get all backed up. We're drowning in paperwork, then actually drowning, careless fighting off sharks with a stapler, and pirates are pillaging the office copier, and then I wake up.
Don't let hiring nightmares ruin your dreams. LinkedIn Jobs' new AI assistant goes beyond the resume, using unique insights to deliver a smarter shortlist. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/quality. Start hiring today with LinkedIn.
And we're back. Okay, folks, Eric and I were just talking about the runaway train scene on the lower lot, which actually didn't come online as part of the Universal Tram Tour till 1976. And remember, we were just talking about how Jay Stein has come up with this idea for a new show scene to build along the tram route in 1971. So why does it take 5 years to get this runaway train up and running? And this, Eric, brings us to an interesting part of Universal's operation out in LA, which, while it is admittedly one of the biggest tourist attractions in all of Southern California, it is still a working movie and television production studio. Which is exactly what Jay came up against when he initially reaches out to the production side of Universal and says, hey, I need one of the streets down in Six Point, Texas for a new show scene for the tram tour. And to which the production side of Universal turns this time and says, no, sorry, can't help you there. We need every single street we've got down at 6 Point, Texas. We shoot westerns down there. And
they had 6 and they couldn't spare one?
Well,
come on.
This is the thing. Well, Jay is like, yeah, you used to shoot westerns down there. And so, this leads to a really awkward couple of years behind the scenes at Universal Studios, where Jay, again, was obviously a champion of growing the tram tour out into this must-see attraction that folks who are visiting Southern California, like the Hersey family, later this year,
That's right.
something they have to go see. So it's like he keeps circling back on, I need to add a show scene to 6 Points, Texas, because there's nothing going on in here. There are so few westerns being shot at Universal at this point that to validate what Eric just said, that the trams are rolling through and they're looking at empty streets, dusty sets, and yes, tumbleweeds. All right, so now on the production side of Universal Studios, they're like, well, look, I get it. We may not shoot every day down in 6 Point, Texas, but we do still occasionally use those sets. And Eric, they're not actually wrong. If you look over Universal's production logs for this specific period in the studio's history, you will see that feature films like Two Mules for Sister Sarah and Rooster Cogburn had been shot down in 6 Point, Texas. Likewise, actually hugely popular television shows like Battlestar Galactica and Knight Rider.
Battlestar Galactica, a Western, Jim. That's a little new to me.
Well, it's one of those things where it's like, hey, we're going back to a primitive planet. Right. Look, they ride horses and they tie them up.
It's like a Doctor Who, right? You got to travel. Yeah, I get it.
All right, there we go. All right, so, but again, if we're being honest here, this is the beginning of a battle that rages even today on the Universal lot in Hollywood, where the theme park side of the operation is constantly looking to expand, add new rides, shows, and attractions, because, of course, that's what makes people return to Universal Studios Hollywood to experience new stuff like say, for example, the Fast and Furious Hollywood Drift, which will be opening at that theme park later this spring. In fact, Derek, is that going to be open when
we're all watching videos last night on YouTube and cupping our hands, praying that like, oh, could this be? Could this be? So we don't know. Don't know yet.
All right. By the way, folks, Hollywood Drift is something of a different animal in that it's not on the upper lot. It's not on the lower lot. It kind of straddles the hillside. But I mean, the load unload is on the upper lot. But, in fact, it's kind of charmed because it was built in a space that nothing had been in there previously, really.
Right.
Whereas whenever Universal Creative has previously added something of size to the Tram Tour, especially down in the lower lot, like King Kong Encounter, the Jurassic Park The Ride, or Transformers The Ride 3D, well, that meant that sets that had previously been in place and had been part of Universal's overall production inventory or sound stages that dated all the way back to the early days of sound film, well, they had to be pulled down, and those then disappeared forever. And this was the argument that the production side of Universal made whenever Jay or any other member of the Tram tour side of the studio made a request to add something to the lower lot. That they're like, look, okay, I know we're not using that set today. And we may not use it tomorrow, but what about next week or next month or next year? Well, what's going to happen if, say, Disney suddenly wants to shoot a Western here? We'll lose all of that potential revenue from renting out that portion of Universal's backlot because we were short-sighted, because we pulled down a standing set so we could then add something to the Tram Tour. And Eric, where this gets especially interesting is Lou Wasserman is the guy right in the middle here. I mean, he's getting it from both sides. He's got Jay Stein saying, you want me to add new show scenes to the Tram Tour. You told me that. But in order to do that, I need parts of the lower lot that I actually set things up on. These production guys have to surrender some territory to me. And the production guys are going to watch them, and it's like, you have to get Jay Stein on a leash. This man is crazy. You see what he wants to do in the lower lot? He wants to turn it into effing Disneyland. Are we a movie studio or a theme park? And by the way, Wasserman, seriously on top of everything every day in regard to Universal. In fact, a famous story about Lou, Eric. Every day when he arrived at the Black Tower at 7 o'clock in the morning, by the time he got to his desk, there was a memo sitting there waiting for him that already had the number of admissions that had been sold that day to Universal Studios Florida. And then I want to say by 12 noon on that same day, he had a similar memo for how many tickets had been sold to Universal Studios Hollywood. And, somewhere along the line there, he'd also get a memo about, how many had sold for Universal Studios Japan. I mean, that's how he was keenly aware of how much the theme park side of Universal was making, but at the same time, he also knew, from a year-to-year basis, all right, well, how much, we're renting out sound stages for other studios, or how much are we spending on our own production? But he knew how much theme parks were actually making for Universal, which is why in the 70s, he was so eager to get a Universal City, Florida thing up and running in Orlando. Right. So anyway, in the end, Lou turns to the production people at Universal and says, look, Jay isn't asking for all of 6 Points, Texas. He just needs one street for his stupid runaway train. We stop the bickering. All right. I don't want to deal with this anymore. You guys figure out which of the streets in 6 Point, Texas has been used least for production in the past 10 years. And then just give that to Jay. All right. And leave me alone. So, the production side of Universal, it follows Wasserman's directive and very reluctantly hands over Denver Street to Stein, which they weren't actually doing him any favors with that one.
Right. They counted the tumbleweeds, and that's where they had the most, right? They're like, there's as many tumbleweeds here as anywhere. Yeah.
Well, now, what was kind of interesting about Denver Street is it was the one that was used least in film and television production for the past decade because it was small, it was narrow, it was kind of at an odd angle, which made it difficult to stage scenes on. But even so, Universal's effects team does what they can with the opportunity. They build this 9-ton, full-sized recreation of a period steam train. So picture this, Eric. You are on the tram tour. We're going through 6 Points, Texas, and then suddenly, just ahead of you, as the tram is still moving, you see a train at full speed heading toward a crossing just ahead of you. It seems, like, oh my God, this is going to be a collision, and at the point with the steam train, and they always timed it so, and this is when they had the 3-car version of the tram tour, so it would hit directly. The idea was, oh my God, it's going to hit the middle of the tram. And at the last second, it suddenly stops. But it's there now in front of you, and the bells clanging, and the whistles screaming, and the thing is belching steam. And then right in front of you, it now begins to back up. And go up the road, and it's like, ha ha ha! This is movie magic. This is how we do this. But I what was interesting about it is the train got so close to the tram that you could see the dummy of the engineer in the engine compartment. All right.
That's pretty darn close, Jim, and which is kind of terrifying because I believe trains are undefeated. Mm-hmm. You do not want to go up against a train, and that is kind of terrifying to be on a tram tour with a 9-ton train heading towards you.
Well, now, speaking of undefeated and frightening, this brings us to a particularly weird moment in the history of the Universal Tram Tour. The A-Team, which was shot on the Universal lot, debuts on NBC in January of 1983. It immediately becomes this hit television show.
Yeah.
So much so that Jay, he decides he wants to capitalize on the success of this and add a little A-Team magic to the Universal Tram Tour. All right. So picture this, folks. It is the summer of 1983, and you are out in Hollywood experiencing the tram tour at Universal, and you're now rolling through 6 Points, Texas, and here comes that runaway train, and it does its last-minute stop. By the way, that's thanks to an innovative double braking system that the effects team at Universal put together. But again, now you're close enough to look into the engine compartment, and who's behind the controls?
Please don't tell me.
Mr. T. All right. So it's not really Mr. T. It's a dummy of Mr. T. But the way it's been explained to me is that the actor, Lawrence Trodo, I want to say his name is, the real Mr. T, was persuaded to record audio that the guests could then hear as the tram tour, rolled by. I don't know how they heard this over the bell and the whistle, but supposedly, he quoted lines of, "Get them tourists out of there. I pity the fool who gets in front of my steam train," And by the way, all right, just a reminder, the runaway steam train on the lower left, not a long-lived portion of the tram tour, was discontinued in 85. Train Effect was dismantled, and Denver Street actually went back to being an active shooting location at 6 Point, Texas. But that said, Eric, those who got to experience the runaway train scene on the Universal Backlot Tour still remember it quite fondly as part of their tram experience. In fact, so much so that just 2 years ago, in fact, this was done April 26th through August 11th of 2024 as part of Universal's celebration of the 60th anniversary of the Hollywood Tram Tour. The effects team at Universal actually recreated this moment on the lower lot. Right down to the warning bells and the whistles.
Oh, that's amazing.
Yeah, and I'm just putting this out there, folks, because I did not get into Universal. Didn't see this, I I have to ask, did they put Mr. T back in the engine compartment? Because I just, did anybody get the summer of 24 get to hear, I pity the fool. And by the way, just to bring this to a close here, Mr. T, and as I just mentioned, real name Lawrence Trudeau, he's still with us.
Yeah.
He is 73 years old, which, if you do the math here, Rick, that means Mr. T was only 20 years old when he appeared in Rocky III as Clubber Lang, and then he was only 21 when he was shooting the A-Team on the Universal backlot. And it just, I did not know that. I just assumed, given how bulked up and beefy this guy was, that he was older than that when he was playing BA on the A-Team. But anyway, folks, we will continue this series. In fact, we'll get to the burning house that Eric mentioned at the top of the house, this week's show on next week's installment of this series. But
yeah, and you'll never guess who's in the top window screaming for help. It's Mr. T. No.
There we go.
No, that's great. I did not know the Mr. T. Now I know Mr. T because he was obviously in WrestleMania 1 and WrestleMania 2. Mr. T was a big deal in the 80s. You do not I learned very much he was household name. I believe he even had his own cereal at some point in time.
He did. Now, what's kind of interesting, in fact, I found this out researching today for today's show, but not a particularly long, spent a long time as a professional wrestler. He retired in 94. Does that sound right? Or,
Mr. T. So Mr. T was brought in to kind of with the WrestleMania 1 pizzazz of Hollywood and making wrestling mainstream. So he wasn't necessarily a trained professional wrestler. He was part of him and Hulk Hogan went against Rowdy Piper and Paul Orndorff in a special tag match at WrestleMania 1, which was the reason we still have WWE today, because it was an overwhelming success. And then the following year, he did a boxing match against Piper. So I think those were his big forays in pro wrestling. But I think he's even in the WWE Hall of Fame because of that. So not necessarily a big time wrestler, but that's how I have my knowledge. I learned my things from Carousel Progress and pro wrestling.
There we go. And I know we've mentioned this on previous installments of the Epic Universal podcast, but given the amount of wrestling that was shot at Disney MGM and Universal Studios Florida, we really need to do some shows about that.
Jim, you would be surprised that I have the first episode already written for us.
Well, there we go. All right.
We will conquer that. I think WrestleMania season is around April. I think we'll put it on the slab and we will talk about some wrestling and Universal overlap. And Disney
love that timing. Okay, let's do that. So, but before we do that, we have to wrap up this week's show, and with that, that'll do it for this week's installment of the Epic Universal podcast. And by the way, if you have any topics or suggestions for future installments of this podcast, feel free to reach out to Eric and myself through social media. And beyond that, thanks again for listening, and we will be back next week.